Well, good afternoon. I'm James Raven, a fellow of the college, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this very special webinar. It's a particular delight and privilege to introduce Professor Anthony King, who will be speaking about Command, the 21st Century General, after which there will be an opportunity for your questions and comments. So if you can use, please, the Q&A functions, whereby you can submit your questions. Anthony King matriculated at Magdalene in 1986, reading archaeology and anthropology. He was professor of sociology at Exeter University at the Strategy and Security Institute, and he's now been for some time professor of war studies at the University of Warwick. His book, Command, the 21st Century General, won the 2020 Military Book of the Year. And that work comes in the wake, of course, of the troubled campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq, and where, he argues, command appeared to be in crisis in the West, and generals were subjected to intense and sustained public criticism. And so this is the starting point for his talk to us today, the transformation of military command in the 21st century, and Anthony's belief that a new practice of command is developing. Rather than directing and leading operations personally, monopolising decision-making, often heroically, a general's decision-making is now, in this technical age, more difficult and diverse, and command, he argues, is becoming increasingly professionalised and collaborative. So, Anthony, it's a very great pleasure to ask you to speak to us.
Well, thanks very much, James. It's very kind, and thanks to the college for organising this event. I'm going to just share a screen with you of the actual PowerPoint. I'm going to speak slightly to a PowerPoint, but hopefully not sort of in a sort of doctrinaire way. Well, as James has said, I wrote this book, Command, 21st Century General. It was published a couple of years ago in 2019, and has sort of had some small reception from last year, especially with the armed forces. But actually, the book was really the concluding volume of a trilogy, which I started actually in the first decade of this century. And that trilogy, which started with a book on European military transformation, and then expanded out and became a sort of sociology of contemporary 21st century military transformation. The second volume was the combat soldier on infantry platoons and their evolution from the First World War to now. And then from that, I moved on to the other end of the scale, not to the sort of small unit combat, but to large scale issues of command. And what I'd like to just give you today is a small insight into the work that I did on command in the last few years, which I published with this book, and to give you some examples, some discussion of the trajectory that I think command has taken. Now, I've got, as I say, I've got a PowerPoint here. I'm just going to talk fairly broadly. The PowerPoint is more than wallpaper, but I won't talk through the slides. It provides some extra evidence, some extra detail that you might be interested in and might support my verbal comments. So let me begin with a problematic, which actually James has referred to. If we look at military command and look at it historically, there's absolutely no doubt of its central importance to war and warfare and to military performance. And I give you this very famous quotation from the Duke of Wellington, where he actually puts a quantitative figure on the influence of Napoleon's command on the battlefield. And this is a ubiquitous claim, the importance of military command in terms of military and operational performance of the armed forces. Well, if that's the case, the last 20 years have been pretty interesting in the United Kingdom and in the West, especially in the United Kingdom and America, where I'd argue we have we've witnessed something pretty close to a command crisis, a legitimation crisis of command, and in some cases of individual commanders. Individual commanders have been personally held accountable for and criticized for decisions they made or did not make in the recent campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I give you just these two examples, both published in 2019, two books published by two British individuals, one a former brigadier, Ben Barry, one's an individual who had served very briefly in the armed forces. But these two books are just a sort of tip of an iceberg that represents a very significant public, academic, policy-making concern about the failures of command in the 21st century. Now, in fact, I mean, there's a lot to say about the failures and the sins of omission and commission over the last 20 years in terms of military command. But I'm not interested in those questions in this book. What I'm interested, as the introduction said, is in the question of mechanics of command itself, the actual practice of command, and investigating whether command as a practice, as a decision-making practice, I'll come on to that in a second, has evolved in the 21st century, that we are looking at a rather different kind of phenomenon from the 20th. And that's what I'd like to try and argue, is that there has been an evolution, and we should understand any failures of command or any successes of command within that context. Now, before I go on to the sort of substantive discussion of command that I'd like to give you today, it's obviously imperative that I give you an account, a definition of what command is. And this seems to me very important, because if you look at either academic texts or military doctrine itself, definitions of command are quite diffuse. They're not confused or confusing in a certain sense, but they are diffuse. Different meanings are attached to the term. So it's absolutely critical, in my view, to have a very clear view of what we mean by command. And in this work, in the project, you know, I was in no way technical. My definition of command was in no way technical, no way unusual. On the contrary, I drew on commonsensical understandings of the term, and indeed military definitions of the term. And you'll see this quotation here. All I meant by command, the way I defined it, was decision making. And there's some interesting literature in management about the importance of decision making as the primary executive function. Now, I think it is worth saying a few things about decision making and why decision making, why command is so important in the armed forces. The armed forces are a highly distinctive organization. They consist of extremely large units. They consist of very large numbers of soldiers, and I'll necessarily start moving towards land warfare, which is what I've specialized in. But an army consists of a large number of soldiers dispersed over very large areas. Although soldiers in small units know each other better than anyone else, most soldiers in the army, the vast majority of people in the army, do not know each other. They're dispersed over large areas. They typically operate in very difficult climatic and geographical environments. And of course, they're facing an enemy who's trying to kill them. So the organizational pressures on the armed forces are extreme. The problem that the armed forces face is an intensified problem of coordination. And it's here that we can start to see why command is so important. Command is effectively a solution to an organizational problem. It's a solution to the problem of coordination. And historically, military forces of any size have invested the authority, the power to make decisions in the body of an individual in order to generate this large-scale organizational cohesion. And we might playfully say, I mean, it doesn't work in every language, but it kind of playfully works in English. Armies give the authority to an individual to give orders in order to create order, in order to create organizational cohesion and order. So command is extremely important. Command refers, in my view, to decision making and the authority to make decisions about the deployment and the use of troops under command. Now, having said that, Command then, the moment we consider the actual activity, the practice of command, decision making gets us quite a long way. But if we look at command more seriously, more closely, there seems to be three ubiquitous universal functions, three elements of command, three distinctive areas, three functions which characterize and constitute command. And the first, and the most important in my view, is mission definition, the decision to decide what to do. Drucker's, the famous management consultant, management scholar, Peter Drucker's lovely phrase, what is our business? That the commander's supreme authority is to decide what the business of the military operation is, decide what the mission is. And I actually reserve this act of a mission definition, the term command itself. I think that that is the supreme act of decision making, and the term of command should be reserved for that. But command as mission definition encompasses two other crucial elements. Once a commander has defined what the mission is, what the troops under command will actually do, what the army will do, what the division, etc., will do, that's the beginning of command work, because we move to the next area encompassed by command, but a critical area of management. Every mission consists of hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of tasks. Units have to accomplish a series of tasks in order to achieve the overarching mission. And the job, the role, the duty of commander is to identify all those tasks, to prioritize, to sequence them, and to assign them. And then as the mission begins, inevitably to control and coordinate the tasks as difficulties arise. So management, especially with a large military force, becomes the most time-consuming and difficult element or onerous element of command, the management of all of these diverse tasks. Now, it's obviously closely interrelated with mission definition, but it's not the same thing. Management is a slightly different function encompassed by mission definition. The way you define the mission will define and determine the eventual management of the tasks. But it's not the same thing. And finally, leadership, motivating troops. And of course, generals have a special problem of motivation. All executives have to motivate their employees to do some work, but generals have to motivate their soldiers to risk their lives and potentially kill the enemy. And so the problem of motivation is particularly salient in the armed forces. Now, having said that, I'm not going to talk much about leadership in this talk. In order to elaborate this kind of argument about the professionalization of military command, the increasingly collaborative nature of military command, I'm going to focus on the first two areas, and the example I'll give in a second will be James Mattis. But let me go on to the problem which faces a 21st century commander. So if commander's decision making, and it consists of these acts of mission definition, management, leadership, then it seems to me that 21st century commanders face a quite difficult situation, that the character of the armed forces as an organization and the nature of military operations has evolved very significantly from the 20th century. And to summarize this table, I would say this, that if you look at 20th century operations, the central problem for a general was a problem of scope. It was a question of organizing mass. We move to the 21st century, scale, and if we move to the 21st century, we see the problem becoming one of scope, i.e. it is about coordinating diverse assets in complicated situations. To affirm and to correct myself, we move from a problem of scale to a problem of scope. Now, let me just give a little bit more detail on this, just to affirm and confirm the point. If you look at military doctrine at the moment, US and British and indeed Western European military forces are increasingly developing a new lexicon to talk about 21st century operations. And one of the most common is this concept of multi-domain battle. In other words, even a general in the army is no longer fighting just a simple battle on terrain, a sort of two-dimensional fight on terrain, but is actually involved in a complicated multi-domain battle, which involves, of course, the airspace inevitably, but also informational and cyberspace. And so the problem which is put to 21st century generals is of a different type to that which was put to 20th century generals. Now, let me just say this a little bit more and define this a bit more. My work focuses on the divisional level. The divisional level refers to an army formation of about 20,000 troops. The division was first invented in the mid 18th century, famously by Frederick the Great. But the modern division really was a product of the First World War and referred to a fully organized combined arms formation: artillery, infantry or tanks, subsequently engineers, logistics, all in one unit, something which Slim called a full orchestra of war. And my work focuses on this divisional level, a formation of about 20,000 troops, normally about 3 brigades. Well, if we look at the divisional level in the 21st century, what we see is an increase in decision complexity. Commanders have to make more decisions about a greater range of topics, of areas than they did in the 21st century. And I would summarize this as there's 5 kind of vectors of transformation, of decision transformation, of decision complexity. The ranges of operations has expanded very substantially. A divisional front on the First World War in the Western Front was no more than 3 kilometers, 3,000 meters, and often it was much less. Well, a 21st century division is operating over hundreds of square miles, over very large areas. In contrast, the functions of a divisional and a divisional commander have changed. It's not just combined arms warfare. It's not just artillery and your maneuver units. Air power, interagency agents, and increasingly hybrid local indigenous forces become a key part of the questions which are raised. Thirdly, domains have expanded into electronic, cyber, informational, and indeed I might slightly liberally say the urban domain has become one of the primary areas here. And also the time spans of military operations, of divisional operations have changed, and changed quite interestingly. At one level, divisional operations have expanded, extrapolated in terms of time span. So in the 20th century, a divisional commander would deal with operations typically over about a 24-hour cycle, would be giving orders over a 24-hour cycle. But in the contemporary environment, over the last two decades, what we see is divisional commanders are actually planning effectively not operations, but they're almost campaigns over weeks and months, so that the time horizon for a divisional commander to deal with has expanded hugely. But at the same time, it's also contracted because of digital communications, precision munitions. Divisional commanders can mount strikes with extreme speed. And so there's 2 time cycles which divisional commanders are working on at the same time, putting very significant pressure on them. And finally, of course, and most obviously, divisional commanders are under intense pressure in terms of precision, or Western divisional commanders are at least, that they are under legal pressure and legal and media oversight to engage in proportional and legal strikes. And although it's easily forgotten historically, I'm afraid to say if you look at divisional commanders, if you look at military commanders in the 20th century, a commander, you look at divisional commanders either on high intensity war fighting, Second World War, First World War, Korea, or on the counterinsurgency campaigns, especially of the post-war era. And divisional commanders could essentially kill anyone that they wanted, and there was no legal oversight. There was no accountability. Situation is quite different for a contemporary divisional commander, for a major general. They're under intense oversight. So the decision complexity, the precision of decisions, the range of decision making has expanded. Now, this leads me to my kind of thesis that what's happened? Well, in order to deal with this multiplication and diversification of decision making, commanders have had to increasingly devolve and decision-making authority and share decision-making authority with a group of subordinates, deputies, staff officers who support and increase their decision-making capacity. And what we see is the emergence of something I call command collectives or collective command, whereby professionalized groups of military officers sort of unite underneath the commander, supporting the commander and augmenting the commander's decision-making capacities. Now, let me go on and try and, this is all very abstract. Let me try and give you an example of what I'm trying to describe here, to provide some evidence and some color to this theory. And the example I want to give you is James Mattis as the Major General of 1st Marine Division, as the General Officer commanding, the Commanding General, as the Americans would call it, of the 1st Marine Division during the Iraq invasion. Now, why do I choose this example? It's an old example. It's 18 years. It's now almost exactly 18 years old. As an example, and also refers to sort of intense war fighting rather than a hybrid counterinsurgency. But the example seems to me to be pertinent, and it seems to be pertinent for a number of reasons. One, it seems to me that if you were going to get a traditional 20th century form of command, of decision making, it's most likely where Western forces are engaged in high intensity interstate warfare. So the example of Mattis strikes me as a very useful one, especially since in terms of actual Western military forces, those 3 weeks of combat in March through April 2003 are the only example we've got of Western forces directly taking on a state competitor. Now, of course, the Iraqi state was an extremely weak state with a very weak military, but still it provides a pertinent example. Indeed, it provides the only example we've got at this point. Second reason is actually Mattis himself represents, in my view, the hard case. He's an extraordinarily charismatic and capable commander. Who in many ways, both deliberately and just by force of his personality, could be seen as a completely typical heroic military general, absolutely in line with the traditions of the likes of Montgomery or Patton. And so it provides a sort of sociological challenge, as if we can see a sort of professionalized collective system of command with Mattis, maybe we can see it proves the case everywhere where we look in other examples. So let me give you let me talk through a little bit about this command, Mattis' command of the 1st Marine Division. Now, I'm sure many of you were familiar with, still remember, probably still have nightmares about the Iraq war in the first phase. But this is a little map that shows you the operation, the invasion of Iraq. And Mattis's force was one of 2 assault divisions. 1st Marine Division attacked Baghdad from, you can see on the right-hand axis of advance on the eastern side, and 3rd Infantry Division, which actually was the main force, the Army's 3rd Infantry Division, attacked on the left, on the western axis of advance. And you can see the attack mounted from Kuwait 300 miles up to Baghdad. Now, what's interesting about Mattis is talking to him and talking to his staff officers and some of his subordinates in the course of this research, it was pretty challenging. In a way, it was pretty challenging because everyone I spoke to just said, well, I mean, Mattis is just a dominating intellect, dominating personality, just the dominating figure in the division. So the notion that in any way there was any sort of collaborative command, any distributed notion of collectivized command system, still less command by committee, totally ludicrous. So you got, you know, at one level, my interviewees, including James Mattis himself, disparaged entirely the kind of arguments that I was trying to make. But 1 second later, they would say something apparently contradictory, which was to say, oh yes, but he was the master of the distribution of command authority. He was brilliant at distributing authority, trusting his subordinates to make decisions for him and allowing them to get on with the battles that they were fighting. So you ended up with this strange paradox of Mattis, the sort of monopolising heroic commander, and Mattis, this more sophisticated, professionalized, consensual delegator. And I think if we try and resolve this paradox, we start to get quite close to the issue of a collective command system, a system of professionalized collective command. And that's what I'd like to do. Now, one of the ways that we can start to resolve this paradox is to actually think in terms of the functions of command, and think in terms particularly of mission definition as that prime supreme act of command, and mission and then mission management. Now, interestingly, Mattis defined the mission very clearly. He didn't get a proper order from his superior commanders. And he was in fact pretty critical of Tommy Franks, General Tommy Franks at Central Command in Tampa, Florida, who should have been developing a command for 1st Marine Division. What he got was just a sort of vague order of driving into Iraq and stopping in the desert somewhere in the middle of the country. And Mattis found this totally unsatisfactory. So he himself, as a low-level, tactical level divisional commander, developed a mission for himself, and he decided that the 1st Marine Division would go all the way to Baghdad in support of 3rd Infantry Division and would play a major role in the destruction of Iraqi forces and the destruction of the Saddam Hussein regime. Now, one of the things that's very interesting here is what was followed on from this decision to go all the way to Baghdad. And you'll see here, he says, we knew that the center of gravity was speed. Now, this was interesting. There's 2 reasons why he identified speed. One, logistics. A Marine Division is not designed to travel 300 miles inland. A Marine Division is designed to mount an amphibious assault, go about 5 miles inland, and then be quite quickly withdrawn. And so this was a unique challenge. The march up, as Mattis called it, the attack on Baghdad, was a unique challenge. Speed was critical because if they didn't go quickly, the Marines would run out of logistics. They just couldn't support such an advance if it dragged on into weeks and, God forbid, for them, months. So speed was critical. But there was a second reason why speed was critical. And this became, for me, really interesting, that Mattis realized there might be, if the campaign to destroy the Saddam Hussein regime dragged on into weeks and months, there'll be increasing international reaction, and especially from the Middle East, from the Arab countries in the Middle East, or potentially. And so he took the decision that speed was the absolute primary modus operandi for the 1st Division. Note what's happening here. A commander designated as a pure tactical commander, someone who's only interested in a close fight in the battle, is actually drawing on operational and strategic level inferences in order to define the mission. Now, let's go on. So Mattis defined the mission, but even Mattis could not command and monopolize the decision-making for this whole operation. The 1st Marine Division that deployed into Iraq and fought the Iraq invasion, fought its way to Baghdad, consisted of 20,000 Marines, 8,000 vehicles. The march column was 90 miles long, and it was about 25,000 feet high as well. So its air support went up to about 25,000 feet. So it's this extraordinary kind of animal sort of lurching across the desert in 2003, extraordinarily complicated, and it was being engaged in combat, not always right along the order of march, but there were fights and battles going on along the march column. So it wasn't just a fight at the front and then everything else behind was support. There were fights going on at all places. So it's a very complicated machine that Mattis was trying to deal with. Well, how did he deal with the management of the task? Well, as I say, even he couldn't begin to cope with the velocity and diversity of decision making, even though he's a highly capable and intelligent man and a very competent general. So what he started to do, I'd argue, is form a series of command partnerships. The first with his co-commander, as it were, with James Amos, who was the commander of the 3 Marine Air Wing. Essentially, 1st Marine Division was an independent entity, but in order to be able to advance quickly, it cut down lots of logistics, including artillery. And so therefore it was much more dependent on air power than a normal Marine division would be for fire support. And this drove Mattis and Amos together. And what I'd suggest to you is they formed this very interesting kind of co-command, what the military calls supporting command partnership, where undoubtedly for most of the time Mattis was the senior partner, the supported commander whom Amos supported with his aircraft. But every so often, Mattis supported the efforts of Amos to establish new airfields as the advance continued. So there was a partnership, a very close partnership. The command was a kind of co-command of this hybrid organization, 1st Marine Division and 3 Marine Air Wing. Now, even more importantly, what Mattis did with his subordinate commanders is to create a kind of fraternity, command fraternity, a densely solidary group of commanders. Essentially, he recognized that all commanders in 1st Marine Division were distinguished by a unique shared responsibility. Only they had Title 10 responsibility, that is the responsibility to order troops, to order Marines to kill the enemy and also to risk themselves. And so what he did was, on the basis of this shared, unique, distinctive status of being responsible for giving orders, he united his combat team commanders, regimental combat team commanders, and battalion commanders into a command fraternity. It was about 15 people strong, 15, 20 people strong. It was kind of like a rugby team of individuals. And he developed very close relationships with these individuals. Now, the relationship, I'll just click on, the relationship wasn't just one of sort of warm trust, although there was some very significant close trust and warmth in the relationship, but it was a highly technical relationship. What Mattis did was to prepare his subordinates to make decisions in line with the requirements of the 1st Marine Air Division. So through a series of procedures and practices, this is a photograph of something called a rehearsal of concept drill, which Mattis ran a couple of before the operation. He rehearsed and imaged likely decision making for his subordinates, so that they, in the face of potential enemy action, would know the parameters of their appropriate decision making at each point of the advance. So essentially, they were queued up and instructed and taught the kinds of range of decision they could make, which were consistent with Mattis's concept of operations, and which were consistent with maintaining the closest integration of this very complicated machine, the 1st Marine Division, as it advanced into Iraq and up into Baghdad. So there was a very dense professional element to this decision making. It wasn't just ad hoc sort of comradely solidarity. The trust was informed and infused a highly sophisticated system of professionalized and anticipated decision making. And indeed, we can see the force of this in the course of the march up. One of Mattis's regimental combat team commanders, Regimental Combat Team Commander 1, Colonel Joe Dowdy, was deemed to not be abiding by Mattis's mission, i.e. he was too slow, he was not advancing fast enough, he was too cautious, he was not advancing fast enough. And Mattis called him back to his temporary command post on the 4th of April in the middle of the night and sacked him right there and then on the spot and replaced him with a colonel from the headquarters. So what we see is a dense solidarity, a dense fraternity, a dense relationships between commanders, but held together by a pretty ruthless professional obligation, a professional duty to make the decisions, to be held to the decisions which Mattis and his commanders had worked out as the best decisions in their preparation for the campaign. Now, we're approaching very much near the end. Let me just say a couple of words about, literally a couple of words about the staff, and then I will come to a conclusion. So what I've talked about so far is the management of the mission, management of the task by a command team who were delegated to make decisions. Decision-making was distributed to them. They were given autonomy to make decisions, but note their decision-making was closely integrated between each other and with Mattis at the divisional level. Now, what happened with the staff? What happened with the headquarters? Well, Mattis famously really doesn't like staff officers. He's said many critical things about staff officers. He's not a fan of staff work, not a fan of or excessive staff work, not a fan of large headquarters, and certainly not pointless headquarters. But it'd be wrong to think that the headquarters wasn't vital in this operation, in his system of command. The staff were absolutely critical, and Mattis engineered the headquarters in order to facilitate this system of decision making, this system of command that he had instituted. And there were two ways he did this. First of all, he selected people he knew and had worked with before, particularly people he'd worked with on a brigade level task force in Afghanistan in the previous year, Task Force 58. And he selected people, therefore, he knew well. And also, it's very noticeable that the rank profile of staff officers in the 1st Marine Division headquarters was low, majors and lieutenant colonels. And this gave Mattis certain advantages because colonel status in the Marines is a big deal. It's the full bird rank is a big deal where colonels can create difficulties for even major generals. And by having relatively junior staff officers in post in key places, Mattis was able to create a group of people that were, as you can see the phrase here, from one of his most important staff officers, Clark Lethene. They were hungry, i.e. They weren't bound by procedure, by tradition, and also were prepared to effectively enact the kinds of things that Mattis, the kind of decisions which Mattis wanted to make. Now, the second element of these staff officers was the so-called eyes officers. The eyes officers was an idea that that Mattis nicked from Montgomery when Montgomery was an army group commander, where certain staff officers, Clark Lethene among them, were identified as kind of, in a way, Mattis's spies, individuals who went out, weren't stuck in the headquarters as traditional staff officers, but went out on the ground and observed what was actually happening at certain decisive and friction points, and indeed at the start, the eyes officers tended to go to precisely those points recognized in the rehearsal and concept drills where there might be problems, like An-Naziriyah, which proved to be not just a problem, but a really significant, a very significant difficulty indeed. And so, and there seems to be some, you know, this is an inference. This is I'll just put a second light on here. This is an inference, but it seems that the sacking of Dowdy, of Colonel Dowdy, may have partly been initiated by concerns raised by staff. In fact, I'm pretty confident of that, and indeed by particular eyes officers who were watching the slow progress of the Regimental Combat Team 1. So what do we see here? Well, if we look at 1st Marine Division and Mattis command system as a whole, what we have is quite an interesting architecture, I'd say. We have two essential circles of command. One, his commanders, the actual acknowledged, legally recognized decision makers, united at every level as a command team, as a command collective, united around a mission, understanding the parameters of decision making, and linking those decisions with each other and with Mattis. So an integrated body, an integrated team of decision makers. But above this web was a second circle, the staff officers who supported the commander's decision, monitored their performance, and prepared the division for the subsequent division decisions which commanders from Mattis down to the battalion level would have to make. So what it suggests we see with 1st Marine Division is a intricate and complicated system of command. For sure, Mattis is the prime reference point here, but that what he built was a integrated collective system, highly professionalized system of decision making. Now, let me come absolutely to the conclusion, just to bring the talk hopefully together a little bit. And also to just clarify any potential misinterpretations, misunderstandings. And this is a question, this question that I put here on the slide is one that I was asked during the research many times and subsequently in talks and discussions. Does collective command mean command by committee? Well, I give you this quote from David Petraeus. It does not. Absolutely not. One of the interesting things about command in the 21st century is that actually commanders have become more important, especially in terms of mission definition. Divisional commanders, maybe even commanders at a lower level, brigade commanders, battalion commanders, are no longer typically in a pristine, nicely thought out military hierarchy where they receive orders from their superior, they refine those orders, define the mission they've been given, refine the mission they've been given, and enact it. On the contrary, generals, especially at a senior level, division and above and even below, are in this kind of odd politico-military orrery. They're subject to extraordinary levels of pressure and influence from a number of different actors. And their job is to distill all of the input, all of the interests of the various stakeholders that are driving and supporting the mission. So in the 21st century, there can only be one sun in the solar system. There can only be one center of gravity in this highly complicated politico-military orrery. And that center is the commander. So the commander is absolutely central to the entire operation of the system, as Mattis showed, I think, in Iraq. But precisely because of the transformation of military force and operations, in order to manage the missions, to coordinate and deliver and accomplish the missions that reflect those complicated interests of this politico-military nexus, commanders increasingly have to delegate and distribute their authority to make decisions, but not just to randomly decentralize and let their subordinates do whatever they want in a laissez-faire way. On the contrary, to create a system of intensely integrated decision making across the board. And of course, just one final comment. Of course, the military might be extreme here, but one of the things that strikes me as interesting, if you look at other organizations, other civilian organizations faced with problems of globalization, diversification, etc., you see actually quite similar or quite parallel, compatible transformation. So just to finish, what I think we see, what I've tried to argue and what I think we see is not a revolution in command from the 20th century, but a very significant evolution, a very significant development of the practice of military decision making. Thanks very much. I will stop there and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Anthony, so much. That was wonderful. And indeed, we have a flood of questions for you. They're in a number of different sort of categories. We've got a number of questions about political interference and a number of questions also about adversaries command. Let me start, because I'll try and get as many of the questions in as possible and make them as brief as possible as I can. Roger Thomas asks you, he says that a key task of any CEO is to assemble a comprehensive database at low risk of bias. And he says that politicians have failed by asking armies to take on unachievable tasks, and he gives some examples of that. Wonder whether you have any comment on that one.
Oh yeah, this is a great question. I mean, let me just confirm, I couldn't possibly comment about, I mean, that's a very interesting point about the data set, but I'll interpret the question in terms of the sort of task that's been given to the military in a sort of slightly narrow way. So forgive me for that. But yeah, I mean, this is a very pertinent point, which has been made a number of times, that in the 21st century, military commanders have been recurrently given missions that you can't do. So the British, particularly with their low resource base, were given missions in Iraq and Helmand, which they couldn't possibly achieve. And so you're setting up your so as CEOs, Tony Blair, etc., are setting up their subordinates for failure. And I'm sympathetic to this up to a certain point. And it is a problem in the 21st century. Politics invades and infuses military decision-making at a much lower level in the 20th century. But I am a bit skeptical about it in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan. Because if you look at the process, and I would really point you to the Chilcot inquiry here, I mean, the army and the army in particular, but the armed forces more generally, were at least partly responsible for the hideous mess they got themselves into. So here the key point is 2005-06. So British Army in particular is committed to a horrible fight in Basra, a horrible counterinsurgency in Basra, but decides to go to Helmand because that's seen as a more attractive, popular option. And so absolutely, I totally agree with you. Military decision making is no longer in any way pristinely military, and sometimes generals are absolutely put in a position they can't win. But precisely because decision making has been politicized, generals sometimes have made highly politicized decisions that then have produced situations which have undermined them. They've actually destroyed. They've actually sort of undermined themselves, and so. That is something to think about. But the wider point is, look, you're not going to get away. You're always going to have a difficult situation with a politician, and generals who want to go back to some kind of pristine war fighting, they're living an illusion essentially. But it's a very pertinent issue. Thanks for that.
And I suppose it does relate. That goes very nicely to a raft of other questions, sort of really on a similar vein. Let me just pull two out.
Yeah, sure.
Because they may add just something to what I think you've just sort of answered them in a way, but you may have something more to add. It's still about the role of politicians really, or the political tactical aspect. Tristram Rees Roberts asks, is the mission not defined by politicians? And he really wants to know what was the mission in Iraq, for example.
Yeah. This is sorry. Yeah.
And secondly, just the second one to James Brayshaw says. He asks about the extent to which political tactical interference has, as I think you've just said, Anthony, undermined the command and taken it actually away from the general, as he puts it, from the general on the ground?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, so yes, obviously the level that I focused at was, you know, sub-strategic with Mattis, but generally one would say it's a rarity for military general, you know, strategic commanders to get a mission from politicians in a clearly stated. What typically happens is because, and some of this is an alliance problem, because Western forces operate in a coalition, and therefore political leaders are constantly deferring to their partners, totally reasonably deferring to their partners. It's very difficult for, especially a medium-sized European power like the UK, its political leaders to define outright a strategic mission from the outset, give the order to a strategic commander in order to enact that sort of classic Huntingdonian model of military command, of civil military relations. What typically happens, and did happen in Iraq and Afghanistan right through the campaign, is basically a load of horse trading, where the politicians are horse trading with each other in the coalition, horse trading with different departments, and kind of feeling their way towards something that might approach a mission. And the commander has an absolute role in influencing that sort of current of thought. It's not a lovely sort of logical sequence. It's kind of like a river that flows in a direction, and commanders are responding to that. And if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, especially after the invasion was interesting and complicated, driven very much by Rumsfeld, Bush, Cheney, so that kind of triumvirate. But the minute you got into Iraq and Afghanistan properly, what the mission was, of course, became an open question, and generals at every single point, senior generals, were defining and helping politicians to define the mission. Two key points here: the surge in Iraq, did that come out of, was that a political initiative or was it a military initiative? It's very difficult to say, but certainly you would say the American armed forces, especially the US Army and the US Marines, had a major role in altering the mission in Iraq in 2006, and same in Afghanistan in 2009. Again, Barack Obama, the Obama-Biden administration really were pretty clueless. They just wanted to get the hell out of Afghanistan, and were actually, in a way, railroaded into a surge, which they really, to be honest, they weren't really that convinced by. So absolutely take the points, but what I would suggest is that it's a complicated situation that's never going to go back to, if it ever was pure, which I doubt, it's never going to go back that way. So generals have to be really on the politics. Strategic generals, particularly strategic commanders, particularly, have to be on the politics and realize the influence they might need to exert. Yeah, but the tactical interference, that can be a problem. I mean, it was a bit of a problem sometimes in the 20th century, but that can be a major problem. And sometimes it's had a nefarious influence, but it's the reality of the kind of weird media, legal, political oversight in which, the context in which campaigns are fought. And actually, precisely because you've got this constant political interaction, one of the things that typically happens with a commanding general, they're not actually commanding their own troops in a traditional way. They give that, if they, recurrently, senior generals are giving the traditional job of military operations to their deputy, and they are linking civil military, they are working the politico-military hierarchy up and outwards. So you actually get this strange sort of duality where the senior commander actually offloads what was the traditional function to a subordinate. And I'll give you an quick example of that. If you look at Nick Carter's very different campaign to Mattis in Iraq 2003, but if you look at Nick Carter in Kandahar in 2009-10, our own Chief of Defense Staff now, or any of the commanders who are commanded against ISIS, any of the American commanders against ISIS, they've become these kind of odd consular kind of roles, and successful ones create a politico-military atmosphere in which they can deliver the mission that they kind of have negotiated and want to deliver. So it's in my view, it's recognizable from the past. It's not totally original, but the problem has changed. And also the idea that you're gonna get rid of political interference, you might as well forget it. It's never going to happen. In a way, in a certain sense, it's worth analysing, but it's no point sort of complaining about. I mean, I've heard lots of senior officers complain about it, but I mean, it's like complaining about mud. It's no point.
And that's wonderful, because that's such a comprehensive answer, Anthony, that I think actually you've covered a point that others asked. Led by an early question by Anthony Field, because he was a little concerned about what level of military command you were really focusing on. And I think you just actually addressed that in terms of, is it tactical, operational, or strategic?
Well, you see, I just to confirm, it's a great question. Yeah, so I went for the division as an organization because after Afghanistan, US and Britain were reinvesting in the divisional level. Now, it became a very interesting level because who knows? What is that level of command? Nominally, if you look at military doctrine, divisional is a tactical level of command, but it is not. It is some weird operational, tactical, sometimes even strategic level of command all in one go. So I didn't realize that when I started the research, but it actually became a very pertinent level because it was a division. It was really doing war fighting and operations at the hard end, but it was, I mean, it transcended traditional categorizations.
That's really interesting, because in fact on that, in terms of the focus on the division, there's a specific question came in that from Simon Hill, who wonders, actually slightly challenging you really, wonder whether you're already focusing on what he calls the wrong construct, the division, and wonders whether you shouldn't rather be focusing on the Marine Air Ground Task Force. And he suggested that Mattis and Amos were rather used to their relationship, and that what you're describing, he says, is a standard USMC practice. So I just wonder whether you had
very good, great question. I mean, look, it's a great point. I mean, I focused on, not to get into boring about the sort of history and the methodology of the project, but I mean, I focused on division level. But in terms of Mattis, look. They were not a Marine Air Ground Task Force, technically, although, as obviously Simon Hill knows exactly that exists. They were two separate divisions under a Marine Expeditionary Force. And the Marine Expeditionary Force, so a corps level force, much bigger force, that constituted together a Marine Air Ground Task Force, that whole Marine Expeditionary Force. But what was really weird is, so therefore Mattis and Amos should have deferred to Conway, the corps commander of the force of the Marine Air Ground Task Force. But it went quite beyond that. They developed this extraordinarily close relationship, and I absolutely agree with you. They developed an extraordinary close relationship. They'd known each other since they'd first joined the Marine Corps. They'd done basic school together. They were very good friends. But to me, that precisely affirms the point that I'm making, that what you see is a partnership. And let me just give you one piece of evidence there. Go back to 1950 and the Chosin Reservoir. First Marine Divisions did their own little march up, and they were supported by a Marine Air Wing, which was utterly critical to their operations. O.P. Smith, who commanded that Marine action, had good relations to Field Harris, who's the Air Wing commander. They met once during the whole operation. So what I'd suggest is, absolutely, I agree that the Marines have this combined jointery in their culture, but in Iraq, we see a very significant intensification of that relationship between the air commander and the ground commander. And what I'd say is, effectively, they formed a weird divisional level co-commanded Marine Air Ground Task Force. So yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'm afraid this is going to have to be the last question because of time, but it addresses another very important area. There's a number of questions on this, but Rob Thompson, from actually sending his question in from Cyprus, asks about adversaries. I noticed as well, you talked a great deal at one point, you said, but as far as the West is concerned. Yeah. So, I mean, he's really asking, what about the system of command amongst Chinese, Iranians, our adversaries? What sort of different system do you think is going on there?
Yeah, well, Rob is a very good and old friend of mine, and was I defer to him as the captain of the second 15 when I was at the college. So, so Rob, it's lovely to hear from you, and I hope you're well in Cyprus, and I hope your lovely family is well down there. And I'm looking forward to seeing you when you get back, or even if I can get out after this. Yeah, look, my work focused on the big sort of five Western forces: America, Britain, Germany, and France, where I think this process that I'm talking about was occurring. I did then think, okay, is this just a Western phenomenon? And I did a little bit of research on this. Now, I in no way, I would be really evidentially careful here. I'm not, I'd be cautious about what I'm about to say. I wouldn't stand by it. But I think there actually is evidence that in Russia, in the Russian forces and Chinese PLA, there is evidence of a move to although they're authoritarian countries, authoritarian political systems, I think there is a move to a more collectivized system of command. Because if you look at the way they're reorganizing their forces, you look at campaigns such as in the Ukraine, especially Russia is the obvious example, they've tried to fuse these different elements of command. So not just traditional fire and maneuver, but information, special operations forces in a more agile and integrated way. And so, although I'd be very careful, and I have no doubt that the systems of command will be culturally differentiated in Russia, in China, etc., that actually, in terms of the reformation of their military organizations, it does strike me that some form of an integrated but disaggregated system of command is implied. So I think within the very different cultural context, very different organizational context, my inference, my suggestion would be they are moving towards something that is not the same as professionalized collective command in the West, but also is of compatibility with it. But it's a really great point. And if there's any PhD students out there, that's the one I would love to, it's one of the ones I'd love to do a supervision on.
Thank you, Anthony. Well, there are, I know actually from the questions, a number of PhD students out there, and a whole raft of other questions, which I'm afraid we simply haven't got time to address. You've filled to the brim our allotted hour with so much. So I hope that will, for those whose questions haven't been raised, I think actually you've covered in this session so much that they will have enjoyed what they heard. And for all of us, it's been really marvelously illuminating, really fascinating. And I think for those of us after the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq, we've thought in various ways about the reasons for and consequences of those interventions. But I've certainly been able to think in new ways about both the more general and the more specific aspects of military decision making. It's been so thought-provoking and really valuable. And so on behalf of everyone, thank you so much again, Anthony, for taking the time to address this.
Oh, thank you. It's a complete pleasure. Thanks, James. I'm really, really honoured and delighted to give the talk. And if people want to talk, ask afterwards, just send me an email. Absolutely delighted to. Obviously, it's a lovely topic for me, an interesting topic. So very happy to talk to people afterwards. But absolutely thanks to the organisers, Emma, Corin, and Sarah. Really appreciate it. It's been really fun to talk to everyone. So thank you.
Thank you.